She told me once, with a quiet smile, "I've lived a lot of years." But that night, under the soft glow of streetlights and unspoken words, I watched her live again. Like time itself had been waiting for her to remember what it feels like to be truly seen. I didn't expect that night to change anything. It was supposed to be an ordinary dinner, a small gathering of a few mutual friends at a quiet restaurant tucked away from the busier streets of the city. The kind of place where the tables are set close enough to feel intimate, but not so close that you can't hear yourself think. The lights were dim, warm, the kind that softened edges and made everyone look a little more at ease. I remember noticing her before we were even introduced. She carried herself differently from the rest of the group. While most people filled the air with casual chatter and laughter, she sat a little back, her smile polite, her hands resting on the stem of her wine glass as though she was content to observe rather than compete for attention. There was something steady about her, like she had weathered enough storms in life to no longer feel the need to prove anything. When our eyes met across the table, it wasn't the kind of glance that demands anything. It was softer, quieter, as though she was acknowledging me without expectation. Still, it lingered just long enough for me to feel the air shift inside me. She turned away almost immediately, laughing at something someone else had said, but the moment stayed with me. Later, as the night grew older and the table grew louder, I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The restaurant's back patio opened into a narrow alley strung with fairy lights, their glow flickering against the brick walls. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the warmth inside. I hadn't expected her to follow, but she did. Her heels clicked softly against the stone as she walked out, her arms folded lightly across her chest, not with defensiveness but with the kind of elegance that comes from habit. She stood beside me, leaving just enough space to be polite, yet close enough that I caught the faint trace of her perfume, something subtle with hints of jasmine. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The muffled laughter of our friends spilled faintly through the restaurant door behind us, but out there it felt like we were in another world altogether. Finally, she said something about the night sky, how the stars looked brighter when you stepped away from the noise. Her voice was low, steady, with a warmth that made the simplest words feel meaningful. And that was all it took. From there, the conversation came easily. We spoke about nothing and everything, the weather, the city, how both of us preferred quiet corners over crowded rooms. She listened with her eyes as much as her ears, her gaze steady, searching. When she laughed, it wasn't loud, but it was genuine, and it left me wanting to hear it again. In that moment, under a string of worn fairy lights in a forgotten alley, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't just curious about her. I wanted to know the stories she carried behind that graceful silence. The next time we met, it wasn't by chance. She invited me to a small cafe tucked between two quiet streets, one of those places that smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and worn leather chairs. The kind of cafe where the music is soft enough that it feels like it's playing just for you. When I arrived, she was already there, seated at a corner table bathed in soft morning light filtering through tall windows. Her posture was relaxed, yet there was a quiet tension in the set of her shoulders, as though she carried the weight of stories she hadn't shared yet. We started with small talk, talking about books, music, and the fleeting charm of ordinary days. But there was an unspoken understanding that we weren't there for idle chatter. At some point, she looked at me and said, almost casually, "I've lived a lot of years." Her eyes were calm, but there was a subtle weight behind her words, a hint of both pride and melancholy. I didn't know how to respond at first. It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of experience, of someone who had seen life's seasons and carried the evidence of time in her smile lines and the quiet steadiness of her voice. And yet, it wasn't a complaint. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had survived, everything she had loved, and everything she had lost. I listened. That's all I did. I let the pause stretch between us, letting her words settle in the warm light. I noticed the little things, the way her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup absent-mindedly, the soft chime of a bracelet as she shifted her hand, the gentle way her gaze softened when it met mine. Each gesture seemed to speak louder than words, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't voiced outright. She began to share fragments of her past. Not stories meant to impress, but stories meant to be remembered, to be felt. About travels that had left her breathless, friendships that had dissolved over time, love that had come and gone like tides. Her voice never trembled, but her eyes sometimes shimmered as though the memory itself carried weight. I could see the hesitation, the careful framing of each story, as if she were testing the waters to see if I would still hold her presence tenderly, even knowing the depth behind her years. And I did. I laughed when she laughed, quietly, savoring the sound. I let the silence sit comfortably between sentences, feeling it as much as hearing it. There was a rhythm to the way we spoke, back and forth, soft and unhurried. She leaned in slightly at one point, elbows resting on the table, her expression open, almost unguarded. I realized then that she wasn't just talking to fill the silence. She was trusting me with fragments of herself she rarely shared. By the time our coffees had cooled and the sunlight had shifted across the cafe floor, the distance between us had narrowed. Not physically, though we had edged our chairs slightly closer, but in a way that mattered far more. The walls she carried so carefully around her heart had lowered just enough for me to see the woman behind the elegance, the laughter, the quiet assurance. And I knew, somehow, that this was just the beginning of learning the contours of a life lived fully, and perhaps, together, something new yet unspoken. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of calm that follows a day full of noise and obligations. After leaving the cafe, we found ourselves walking side by side along narrow streets bathed in the gentle glow of street lamps. The city felt different at night, slower, softer, as if it were holding its breath just for us. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement and distant flowers. I noticed her shiver slightly and instinctively offered my jacket, a gesture so automatic I barely thought about it. She hesitated, her hands brushing the fabric lightly before slipping into the warmth I offered. That brief touch, the weight of her hand against mine as she adjusted the jacket, sent a quiet jolt through me, one that neither of us commented on. We walked without speaking for a while, letting the sounds of our surroundings fill the space between words. The occasional clink of a bicycle bell, the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the far-off hum of traffic that seemed to belong to another world entirely. I stole glances at her, noticing the way her eyes reflected the lamplight, golden flecks dancing as she smiled at some private thought. Her presence felt grounding, yet exhilarating, like walking alongside a quiet storm that I didn't want to end. At one point, we paused under a particularly tall street lamp. Its light haloed her silhouette, and I realized how naturally her movements carried grace. Simple gestures made luminous in that soft glow. She looked up at the stars, tilting her head slightly, and I followed her gaze. The constellations were faint but comforting, like reminders of something constant in an unpredictable world. She spoke then, her voice low and reflective, about how she used to spend nights watching the sky, dreaming of things that seemed distant now. I listened, silently fascinated by the layers of her story. The calm acceptance of years gone by, mixed with a flicker of longing for moments she hadn't yet lived. The moment stretched, delicate and unspoken, until I felt compelled to close the remaining distance between us. Without thinking, I reached out, letting my hand brush hers lightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered, almost imperceptibly, against mine. The contact was fleeting but enough to make the space between us electric, a quiet acknowledgement that we both felt something unspoken, something tender that neither had yet named. We continued walking, slower now, more aware of each other with every step. Our shoulders brushed lightly as we navigated a narrow corner, and I caught the subtle warmth of her presence so close to mine. She glanced at me briefly, and in that moment, there was a question in her eyes, one that mirrored my own curiosity and caution. It wasn't romance yet, not fully, but it was a delicate, fragile tether, woven through glances, shared laughter, and the gentle intimacy of proximity. That night, under the city's quiet sky, I realized that some connections don't need words to exist. Sometimes, a touch, a look, A shared silence is enough to start something extraordinary. And with every step beside her, I felt that we were moving toward something neither of us could yet define, but both of us would remember forever. We eventually found a quiet bench tucked beneath the overarching branches of an old oak, its leaves rustling softly in the evening breeze. The city lights dimmed behind us, leaving the street bathed in the gentle glow of scattered lamps. For a while, neither of us spoke. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The silence itself had weight, comfortable, charged, intimate. Finally, she exhaled, a slow, almost reluctant sound, and turned to me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Time changes you," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "It takes pieces you didn't even know were yours, leaves you wondering what you've really kept." Her hands rested on her lap, fingers tracing the seams of her coat as though grounding herself in the moment. I didn't interrupt. I let her words hang in the air, felt them settle around us like a delicate mist. Then I spoke quietly, with all the sincerity I could gather. "I see you," I said. "Not the years, not the stories. I see you right now, every line, every pause, everything that makes you, you." Her gaze met mine, and for a long moment, there was a softness there that made my chest tighten. I could see her walls, so carefully built over decades, beginning to shift, just enough for a sliver of trust to shine through. She tilted her head slightly, studying me, perhaps surprised that someone so much younger could understand the weight of her experiences without judgment or condescension. "I don't know why I tell you these things," she admitted, her voice a mere whisper. "Maybe because no one asks, maybe because no one would listen." Her hands flexed slightly, and I noticed the faint tremor as she clasped them together. I reached out instinctively, placing my hand lightly over hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let it rest there, small and still, as though testing the tenderness. The warmth of her hand against mine was quiet but grounding. We talked then, in fits and pauses, of losses and moments of joy, of love that had come and gone, and the dreams she had set aside. Every word was measured, deliberate, yet infused with honesty. When she laughed softly at a memory, it was like sunlight breaking through clouds, a brief, golden warmth that lingered far longer than the sound itself. And yet, for every confession, there was a pause, a hesitation, a quiet glimmer of doubt. She was careful with her heart, but not because she wanted to keep me at a distance. She was careful because she had lived enough years to know the fragility of trust, the weight of hope. I listened. I mirrored her pauses. I offered no solutions, no premature comforts, just presence. Her shoulder brushed against mine, and in that simple contact, there was a reassurance stronger than words. She looked at me then, her eyes soft but searching, as if asking silently, "Can I trust this? Can I let myself feel again?" I squeezed her hand gently, letting her know without words that she could. And in that quiet, under the sway of oak branches and the city's distant hum, something unspoken began to bloom between us. A fragile, tender promise of connection that neither time nor circumstance could easily erase. We didn't speak for several steps after leaving the oak-lined bench, but the silence between us no longer felt empty. It was full, weighted with the honesty we had just shared and the quiet recognition that something delicate had begun to take root. The street ahead was deserted, the hum of distant cars softened by the night. I noticed the way her coat caught the lamplight, the subtle shimmer of her hair brushing her shoulders as she walked. Each detail felt amplified, alive, because I was seeing her differently now. Not just the graceful surface, but the woman behind it. We paused again near a small park, where the grass was still damp from an earlier rain. A low wooden fence edged the path, and she leaned against it, letting her shoulders sag slightly as if releasing a bit of the tension she had carried so far. I stopped a few steps away, unsure whether to move closer or let the moment linger as it was. Then, almost unconsciously, her hand reached out. Not dramatically, not deliberately, but just enough that her fingers brushed mine when I adjusted my balance. I froze for a heartbeat, feeling the coolness of her skin and the faint warmth that came with her hesitation. The brush of her fingertips carried a quiet electricity, a subtle confirmation that she was present, that she wanted this shared closeness even if she didn't fully understand it herself. I didn't move my hand away. Instead, I let it linger, letting the weight of the silence carry meaning between us. She shifted slightly, resting her palm more intentionally on mine, but just barely. The contact was fleeting, yet it spoke more than words ever could. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, shallow at first, then slower as she seemed to settle into the quiet intimacy. Her eyes met mine, and I noticed the flicker of a smile, small and unguarded, like sunlight breaking through clouds she had kept to herself for years. We remained like that for several long moments, hands touching, shoulders nearly brushing, letting the night and the stillness around us serve as witness. There was a tension in the air, yes, a tender anticipation, but it wasn't the kind that rushed, demanded, or pressured. It was the tension of two people discovering that proximity could carry emotion, that a shared glance, a lingering touch, could speak volumes about desire, curiosity, and quiet trust. Finally, she pulled her hand back slightly, letting our fingers barely linger as she adjusted her coat. I didn't reach for her immediately. I didn't need to. The closeness had been acknowledged, a silent confession of sorts, and both of us understood its weight. We walked again, side by side, slower than before, almost as if trying to prolong every step. Every brush of our arms was electric, every shared glance meaningful. It was becoming clear to me that intimacy doesn't always arrive in words or declarations. Sometimes, it lives in the small, fleeting gestures, the quiet brush of a hand, the gentle lean of a shoulder, the way someone lets you share space without fear. That night, under the hum of city lights and the distant echo of life around us, I realized something quietly thrilling. Sometimes, touch says what the heart can't yet dare to voice, and in that gentle acknowledgement, the beginning of something extraordinary can unfold. We walked slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the small street where her apartment waited, the night quiet around us. The city had faded into a soft hum behind the occasional flicker of streetlights and the distant rhythm of traffic. There was a warmth between us now, a fragile, unspoken acknowledgement of the closeness we had shared. Every step carried a weight of possibility, a hint that tonight might be different from all the other nights that had gone before. She paused at the corner, her hand brushing against the railing of a small stoop as if to steady herself. The breeze caught a strand of her hair, and she tucked it back behind her ear, her fingers lingering near her face. I felt a pull in my chest, a quiet ache to reach out, to close the small distance between us, but I waited, letting the moment breathe. "Do you ever feel," she began softly, almost hesitant, "that you've lived all your years without really feeling alive?" Her eyes met mine, wide and searching. There was no pretense in them, no guarded elegance. Just the raw honesty of someone daring to be vulnerable for a fleeting moment. I stepped closer, my hand brushing hers lightly. Not demanding, not pushing, but offering the smallest tether of connection. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let our fingers rest against one another, the subtle warmth of contact grounding her, grounding me. A soft laugh escaped her lips then, almost disbelieving, tinged with wonder. "I haven't felt like this in years," she whispered, her voice carrying a delicate mixture of relief and astonishment. Relief that she could still feel, still respond to a moment of connection, and astonishment that someone younger could see her. Not just her age, but the depth behind her eyes. I could see it in her posture, in the slight relaxation of her shoulders, in the gentle tilt of her head as she leaned toward me, not fully, but enough to share space in a way that felt new and precious. Her presence was alive, electric even, but quiet, like a hidden spark finally reaching the surface. We lingered in that soft glow of streetlight, our steps paused, the night pressing close. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek, my fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She didn't flinch. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, and I felt the subtle shift in her breathing, the tiny catch that betrayed the flood of feeling behind her calm exterior. "I've lived a lot of years," she said again, softly, almost like a confession this time. But tonight, I feel alive again. Her voice trembled slightly, a hint of emotion she had carefully contained before. I smiled, words unnecessary, letting my hand rest gently on the small of her back as she leaned slightly into my presence. In that quiet street, under the glow of the lamps, time seemed to pause for us. It was a moment of rebirth, of recognition. She had remembered what it felt like to be seen, to be appreciated, to be unexpectedly alive in someone else's company. And as she finally opened the door to her apartment, we lingered together, not rushing the goodbye. The night had transformed her in a way words couldn't capture. She had lived again, through laughter, touch, and the quiet magic of shared presence. And I had witnessed it all. We stood at the threshold of her apartment, the soft glow from the porch light spilling across the steps and catching the edges of her hair. The night had deepened around us, leaving only the quiet hum of distant traffic and the occasional whisper of leaves in the gentle breeze. Neither of us spoke immediately. There was no need. The hours we had shared, the stories, the laughter, the long silences, and the subtle touches, all of it, had carried more meaning than any words could convey. She leaned slightly against the doorframe, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, and I noticed the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze lingered on me, hesitant yet steady. I stepped a little closer, closing a fraction of the space between us, careful not to rush. My hand brushed against hers, light and reassuring, letting her feel the warmth and steadiness of presence without demanding anything in return. Her eyes met mine, wide and soft, and I could see the quiet transformation that had taken place over the course of the night. She had lived fully, in ways she hadn't allowed herself for years, and somehow she had let me witness it. The thought was humbling, tender, and utterly captivating. We embraced slowly, deliberately. Her arms curved around my waist, and I held her gently, careful not to crush the fragile moment with urgency. Her cheek rested lightly against my chest, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat beneath my hand. A subtle, grounding reassurance that she was here, fully present, fully herself. The world outside the door disappeared. For a few moments, there was only this: the warmth of her, the quiet steadiness of her breath, and the delicate intimacy that had grown naturally between us. Pulling back just slightly, we lingered in each other's gaze. She smiled, a soft, unguarded smile that carried both relief and hope, and whispered, "Thank you for tonight." Her voice trembled ever so slightly, betraying the depth of emotion she rarely displayed. I smiled in return, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "No, thank you," I said softly, "for letting me see you like this, for letting me in." There was a pause then, long and quiet, where neither of us moved. The night seemed to hold its breath, giving space for everything that had passed and everything that might come. Finally, she stepped inside, but the way she paused in the doorway, her eyes still searching mine, told me that this was not the end. It was the beginning of something neither of us could yet name, but both of us could feel. As I walked away, each step lighter than the one before, I carried the warmth of her presence with me. I could still feel the faint weight of her hand against mine, the echo of her laughter, the quiet assurance in her eyes. She had lived again tonight, and in a way I had too, because I had witnessed her courage, her vulnerability, and the beauty of a heart daring to feel after years of restraint. I glanced back once more at the softly lit doorway, and she was watching, a small smile lingering on her lips. There was no need for words, no promise spoken aloud. The night had said it all, and I knew, without a doubt, that there would be more nights like this, slow, tender, and unforgettable. As she stepped inside, I knew tonight was only the beginning. If you felt the warmth, the quiet tension, or the magic of this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share this with someone who believes in slow burn love, and leave a comment telling us which moment made your heart skip a beat. There's more stories like this waiting for you, so stay with us, and let the next journey unfold.